20 doctors failed to save the billionaire who was on the brink of death. The world's finest medical minds had exhausted every possible treatment, leaving his family to prepare for the inevitable. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The Chicago skyline had always bowed to John Smith. From his glass-walled penthouse 52 floors above Michigan Avenue, the pharmaceutical tycoon had built an empire that transformed modern medicine. Magazines called him unstoppable. Competitors feared him. Hospitals named wings after him. Yet now, as winter descended on the city, John found fans watching that familiar skyline through increasingly unfocused eyes. "Mr. Smith, your medication," soft voice said from behind him. John turned slowly, his movements deliberate and pained. Mary Johnson stood in the doorway, a tray balanced in her hands. At 38, the maid had worked in his home for nearly 3 years, moving through the vast spaces with quiet efficiency. "Leave it there," he muttered, gesturing vaguely toward a side table before turning back to the window. Mary placed the pills beside a glass of water, studying her employer's reflection in the window. His once commanding frame had diminished, shoulders hunched forward as if carrying an invisible weight. The billionaire's tailored clothes now hung loosely on his body. "Will there be anything else, sir?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. John shook his head without turning. Mary lingered a moment longer than necessary, her dark eyes registering details that the parade of specialists had somehow missed. The slight tremor in his right hand, the yellowish tint to his skin, the way his breath caught when he moved too quickly. As she turned to leave, she caught the faint scent of lavender in the room, her own doing. She had placed sprigs in small vases throughout the penthouse, a habit carried from her Kentucky childhood. Her grandmother had used lavender for healing, claiming it soothed troubled souls and eased physical pain. The pharmaceutical tycoon would scoff at such notions, of course. His world was one of clinical trials and molecular formulas, not folk remedies passed down through generations. Yet Mary recognized the look in his eyes. She had seen it before, in her uncle before his mysterious illness took him, in neighbors back home who wasted away while doctors scratched their heads in confusion. There was something about John's sickness that felt familiar, something that lived in the spaces between medical textbooks. In the kitchen, Mary prepared his dinner, another meal he would barely touch. Through the window, Chicago's lights began to flicker on across the darkening landscape. She glanced toward the living room where John remained motionless, a silhouette against the panoramic view he once dominated. 20 doctors, she whispered to herself, thinking of the specialists who had come and gone, each more baffled than the last. None of them had answered. None of them seemed to see what she saw. December's snow transformed Chicago into a winter wonderland, but for John Smith, the beauty outside his penthouse windows offered little comfort. The pharmaceutical tycoon had become the city's most perplexing medical mystery. His thick medical file passed from one specialist to another, growing heavier with each consultation yet providing no answers. "We're considering autoimmune disorders," said one doctor from Mayo Clinic, his voice trailing off as John's test results contradicted his theory. "Perhaps it's neurological," suggested the Johns Hopkins neurologist, frowning at brain scans that revealed nothing conclusive. The Cedars-Sinai immunologist shook her head after reviewing his blood work. "Your symptoms don't align with any established pattern." John sat propped against pillows in his king-sized bed, watching the parade of white coats with growing despair. These were the finest medical minds money could summon, yet 20 doctors later, his condition only worsened. His hands trembled as he signed another authorization for experimental treatments, the pen feeling impossibly heavy. Mary Johnson moved silently through the penthouse, emptying wastebaskets overflowing with discarded medical opinion. As she dusted the nightstand crowded with prescription bottles, she observed the physicians with their sophisticated devices and complex terminology. The maid noticed how they pressed stethoscopes to John's chest, but never asked about the photograph he kept hidden in his drawer. "Your vitals are stable, but these tremors are concerning," Dr. Robert Davis said, making notes on his tablet. John's longtime physician looked increasingly frustrated. "I'm consulting with a specialist in Switzerland tomorrow." Mary arranged fresh water by the billionaire's bedside, her movements deliberate and unobtrusive. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory, wisdom passed down through generations in their Kentucky home. Doctors listen with machines, but healers listen with the heart. The old woman had told her while brewing remedies from plants gathered at dawn. The 38-year-old woman recognized something in John that the medical professionals missed. When he thought no one was watching, his gaze drifted to the east wing of the penthouse, the wing that had remained locked since Emily's death. Mary had noticed how his symptoms worsened on birthdays and holidays, how his breathing changed when children appeared on television. While Patricia Brown paced the hallway outside, discussing company contingencies with board members, Mary quietly observed the connection between John's physical decline and the grief he refused to acknowledge. The sophisticated medical equipment couldn't detect the weight of unspoken words or measure the burden of memories. As another specialist departed with a puzzled expression, Mary placed a cup of chamomile tea beside John's bed, the steam carrying a whisper of healing that no prescription could provide. John Smith's office walls were adorned with awards and pharmaceutical patents, but the most important item sat hidden in his desk drawer, a silver-framed photograph of Emily. 5 years had passed since his daughter's death, yet he had constructed an impenetrable fortress around his grief. The billionaire's staff knew the unspoken rule: never mention Emily's name, not if you valued your position. The pharmaceutical tycoon channeled disanguish into an obsessive work ethic, often staying at his Chicago headquarters until midnight. He had donated over $30 million to children's hospitals across the Midwest, as if each wing bearing the Smith name might somehow fill the void. Emily left behind. His latest project, a cutting-edge pediatric research facility, consumed him entirely. Mary Johnson noticed the subtle signs others missed. While dusting his penthouse study, she observed how his hands trembled when he accidentally brushed against Emily's old teddy bear still sitting on a bookshelf. The maid saw how he would stop mid-sentence whenever a child Emily's age appeared on television, his eyes growing distant before he abruptly changed the channel. Once, when delivering his evening tea, Mary overheard a board member begin, "Your daughter would have been proud," before John cut him off with such coldness that the room temperature seemed to drop. The silence that followed was deafening, thick with unspoken pain. In the east wing of the penthouse, a door remained permanently locked. Mary knew it was Emily's bedroom, preserved exactly as she had left it. The key hung on a chain around John's neck, though he never acknowledged it when it occasionally slipped from beneath his shirt collar. During her 3rd month of employment, Mary accidentally knocked over a stack of papers in his home office. As she gathered them, she discovered hospital records, dozens of specialists consulted, experimental treatments explored, documenting Emily's final months. The desperate attempts of a father trying to save his child with all the money and power at his disposal, yet failing nonetheless. That evening, Mary watched John stare blankly at the Chicago skyline, a glass of untouched whiskey in his hand. She wondered how long a soul could survive under such weight, grief calcifying into something hard and unyielding. The pharmaceutical magnate who could heal millions through his companies couldn't heal himself from this most personal wound. What troubled Mary most wasn't his sadness, but his refusal to speak it. Like a cancer left untreated, his silence was consuming him from within. January arrived with a vengeance, bringing not just bitter Chicago winds, but a sharp decline in John Smith's condition. His symptoms worsened dramatically. Violent tremors seized his hands during board meetings, fever left him drenched in sweat most nights, and his tailored suits hung loosely on his rapidly thinning frame. The pharmaceutical tycoon's immune system seemed to be surrendering, one cell at a time. Dr. Robert Davis increased his visits, bringing specialists who left shaking their heads. Each new medication seemed to trigger 2 new symptoms. Blood tests revealed nothing conclusive. Scans showed no obvious cause. The billionaire's penthouse, with its panoramic views of the city skyline, had become an elegant prison of suffering. Patricia Brown watched these developments with calculating eye. The vice president had been waiting years for an opportunity, and John's deteriorating health presented the perfect opening. She began scheduling meetings when he was at his weakest, subtly questioning his judgment in front of board members, and positioning herself as the company's steady hand during this unfortunate transition period. "We need to consider contingency plans," Patricia announced during one meeting, her voice dripping with manufactured concern while John fought to control his trembling hands. The shareholders deserve stability. Meanwhile, Mary Johnson moved through the penthouse like a ghost, witnessing everything but acknowledged by no one. The 38-year-old Maid observed the parade of doctors, the whispered conversations, the predatory circling of executives. She noticed how John winced when swallowing, how his eyes had lost their sharp focus, how he stared at Emily's photo when he thought no one was looking. One evening, as snow pelted against the floor-to-ceiling windows, Mary entered his study carrying a steaming cup of chamomile tea. John sat hunched over financial reports, his complexion ashen. "I didn't ask for tea," he muttered, without looking up. "It might help with the fever," she replied softly, placing the cup beside him. The billionaire waved her away dismissively, returning to his spreadsheets. But after she left, the gentle aroma of chamomile filled the room, cutting through the sterile scent of illness. Almost unconsciously, he reached for the cup, the warmth spreading through his cold fingers. As the steam rose, something unexpected stirred within him, a fleeting memory of his mother's kitchen, of safety and comfort before ambition and loss had hardened him. The sensation was gone in an instant, buried beneath years of practiced indifference. Yet for one brief moment, the tea had reached something medicine couldn't touch. John would never acknowledge it, not even to himself. But that night he slept without nightmares for the first time in weeks. The January morning arrived with a bitter chill that seeped through the glass walls of the conference room on the 40th floor. John Smith sat at the head of the mahogany table, his complexion ashen against the charcoal of his bespoke suit. The quarterly board meeting had been underway for 30 minutes, but the pharmaceutical tycoon had barely contributed, his normally commanding presence diminished to a shadow. Patricia Brown watched him with calculating eyes as she delivered her presentation, noting how his fingers trembled around his water glass. The vice president's voice carried across the room with practiced precision, but John hardly registered her words. The fluorescent lights overhead seemed to pulse, growing brighter then dimmer as a cold sweat broke across his forehead. "As you can see from these projections," Patricia's sentence hung unfinished as John suddenly lurched forward, his body convulsing. The glass slipped from his grasp, shattering against the polished floor. Mr. Smith, Dr. Robert Davis, who had insisted on attending the meeting given his patient's deteriorating condition, rushed to John's side as the billionaire slumped from his chair. The physician's trained hands moved swiftly, checking vital signs as chaos erupted around them. "Call 911," someone shouted. The boardroom transformed into a scene of panic, executives backing away, assistants fumbling with phones, papers scattered across the table like fallen leaves. Within minutes, paramedics burst through the doors, equipment in hand. The Chicago icon, once invincible, now lay unconscious on the floor of his empire, oxygen mask strapped to his face as they loaded him onto a stretcher. His skin had taken on a grayish hue that Davis recognized as dangerously ominous. "BP's dropping," one paramedic announced as they wheeled him toward the elevator. "We need to move now." Across the city, in the staff quarters of John's penthouse, Mary Johnson was folding freshly laundered towels when her phone buzzed. The maid's hand stilled as she read the text from another household employee who had witnessed the collapse. A sensation like ice water flooded her veins, a feeling she hadn't experienced since watching her grandmother tend to the dying in their Kentucky home. Mary closed her eyes, remembering the scent of dried herbs and whispered prayers, the way her grandmother's hands had moved with certainty even when doctors had given up hope. Setting down the towels with deliberate care, Mary moved to her small room and knelt before the wooden chest tucked beneath her bed. Inside lay bundles wrapped in cloth, remedies and rituals passed down through generations. "Not this time," she whispered, gathering what she would need. Mary understood the risk, her position, her livelihood, perhaps even her freedom, if they misunderstood her intentions. But something deeper than reason compelled her forward. She had recognized John's illness from the beginning, not in his symptoms but in his spirit. The time for watching from the shadows had ended. The night shift had just begun at Chicago Memorial, when Mary Johnson slipped through the side entrance. Her borrowed nurse's uniform felt stiff against her skin, but she moved with purpose, clutching a small cloth bundle close to her chest. Inside were the dried herbs her grandmother had taught her to gather under Kentucky's full moon: chamomile for peace, rosemary for memory, and lavender for healing the soul. The hospital corridors buzzed with the quiet efficiency of nighttime care. Nurses huddled at their station reviewing charts while orderlies pushed medication carts past rooms filled with the soft beeping of monitors. Mary kept her head down, her movements deliberate yet unremarkable. She'd spent years perfecting the art of invisibility in John's penthouse. Here it served her equally well. "Floor 6, she whispered to herself, stepping into an empty elevator. The pharmaceutical tycoon's private room would be heavily guarded, but Mary had overheard enough conversations between Dr. Robert Davis and the specialists to know exactly where they'd placed him. When the elevator doors opened, she paused, watching the rhythm of the floor. A security guard sat outside John's room, his attention fixed on a small device in his hand. Mary waited until a group of doctors rounded the corner, then fell in step behind them, slipping past the distracted guard during their conversation. Inside, the room was dimly lit by monitors casting an eerie blue glow across John Smith's gaunt face. The man who once commanded boardrooms with thunderous authority now looked fragile, his breathing shallow and labored. Patricia Brown had visited earlier. Mary knew, not out of compassion, but to assess how quickly she might claim his empire. "Mr. Smith," she whispered, approaching his bedside. When his eyes fluttered open, confusion gave way to recognition. Mary unwrapped her bundle, the scent of herbs immediately softening the sterile hospital air. With gentle movements, she placed a sprig of lavender beneath his pillow, her grandmother's voice guiding her actions from memory. The body remembers what the mind forgets. Taking his trembling hand between hers, she began to whisper words not meant for medicine, but for the wounded spirit. Ancient phrases passed down through generations, spoken in a cadence that seemed to match the rhythm of his heartbeat on the monitor. "Your daughter is at peace," she murmured, daring to speak Emily's name in the sacred space between them. "But you're still here, still needed." His fingers tightened around hers, tears gathering at the corners of his eyes. For the first time in weeks, the billionaire's breathing deepened and steadied. The tension in his face softened as if some invisible weight had begun to lift. Mary stayed until his eyes closed in genuine rest, not the fitful unconsciousness that had plagued him. Only then did she slip away, leaving behind the healing scent of lavender and the first whisper of hope. For the first time in months, John Smith slept without the weight of pain crushing his chest. In his dreams, Emily danced through sunlit gardens, her laughter carrying on the breeze like wind chimes. She wore the yellow dress he'd bought for her 7th birthday, spinning until the fabric billowed around her like petals. He reached for her small hand, feeling her fingers brush against his palm before slipping away, always just beyond his grasp. "Emily, wait," he murmured, the words barely audible in the sterile hospital room. When John's eyes fluttered open, it wasn't his daughter's name on his lips, but Mary's. The pharmaceutical tycoon called out for his maid, his voice ragged yet filled with an unfamiliar emotion, longing. The nurses exchanged glances, puzzled by this sudden attachment to someone they'd never seen visit. Dr. Robert Davis arrived for morning rounds, stopping abruptly at John's bedside. The physician studied the monitors with growing astonishment. Blood pressure normalized, heart rate steady, oxygen levels improved significantly. Even the persistent tremors had subsided. "This is unexpected," he said, reviewing the overnight charts. "Your inflammatory markers have dropped by 30% since yesterday." John merely nodded, his thoughts elsewhere. "Where's Mary? I need to speak with her." The doctor made notes in his tablet, brow furrowed. "I've been treating you for 20 years and I've never seen a reversal like this without intervention." He lowered his voice. "What happened last night?" Before John could answer, Patricia Brown swept into the room, her heels clicking aggressively against the floor. The vice president's eyes narrowed at the sight of John sitting upright, color returning to his face. "The board is concerned," she announced, placing her designer handbag on the visitor's chair. "We need answers about your condition." "I'm improving," John replied simply. Patricia's gaze sharpened. "So I see. Miraculously." After every specialist in the country failed. She glanced at the sprig of lavender on his pillow, picking it up with manicured fingers. "What's this?" Dr. Davis intercepted, taking the herb from her hand. "I'd like to run additional tests before drawing conclusions." As they argued, John turned toward the window. remembering the gentle pressure of Mary's hand on his, the soothing cadence of her voice whispering words his grandmother might have spoken. For the first time since Emily's death, he'd felt something crack open inside him, not to let more pain in, but to finally release what he'd been holding. The Chicago skyline gleamed in the morning light, and John Smith made a silent promise to the woman who had somehow reached through his darkness. He would find a way to thank her, even if it meant facing truths he'd spent 5 years running from. The days grew colder, and Chicago's infamous winter tightened its grip on the city. John Smith stared out from his glass-walled penthouse, watching snowflakes dance against the darkening sky. His reflection looked back at him, gaunt, haunted, a shadow of the pharmaceutical tycoon who once commanded boardrooms with unwavering confidence. Germany, he whispered to himself, clutching his smartphone with trembling fingers. The experimental clinic in Munich had promised revolutionary treatments. Their brochure, filled with medical jargon and promises of miracle cures, sat on his marble countertop. John had already arranged his private jet, desperate to put an ocean between himself and the memories that haunted every corner of his Chicago home. Dr. Robert Davis had cautioned against the trip. "Your condition is too unstable for travel," the physician had warned during their last consultation. But the billionaire dismissed these concerns with a wave of his hand. What did stability matter when every breath in this city reminded him of Emily? The weather forecast interrupted his thoughts. A severe winter storm approaching, the worst in decades. John barely registered the meteorologist's warnings until his device buzzed with an alert. All flights grounded indefinitely. Outside, the snow began falling in earnest, thick white curtains obscuring the skyline he'd once dominated. "No," he muttered, panic rising in his chest. Trapped. The penthouse, for all its luxury, suddenly felt like a prison. Each room held whispers of his daughter, her laughter echoing down hallways, her small fingerprints somehow still visible on glass surfaces despite years of meticulous cleaning. The pharmaceutical magnate paced his living room, heart racing. Without escape, without the promise of German doctors and their experimental treatments, what hope remained? His tremors worsened as darkness fell, the city below disappearing beneath a blanket of white silence. When the power flickered, John found himself gripping the wall for support. The thought of facing the night alone, with only memories for company, sent cold fear through his veins. He stumbled toward the kitchen, seeking something, anything to calm his nerves, and there she stood. Mary Johnson, arranging candles on the counter, her movements deliberate and unhurried. The maid looked up as he entered, her eyes reflecting the soft candlelight. "I thought you might need these," she said simply, striking a match. The storms knocked out power in half the neighborhood already. John froze in the doorway, suddenly aware of how desperately he'd needed another human presence. Mary's calm demeanor seemed to part the chaos swirling around him, creating a small island of peace in the kitchen. "How did you know?" he asked, his voice barely audible above the howling wind outside. Mary smiled, the warmth reaching her eyes. "Some storms you shouldn't face alone. Sometimes the body falls when the soul is starving," Mary Johnson whispered, her voice barely audible above the howling winter wind outside the penthouse windows. The kitchen, with its sleek marble countertops and stainless steel appliances, felt oddly intimate in the midnight hour. John Smith slumped in his chair, exhaustion etched into every line of his face. The pharmaceutical tycoon who commanded boardrooms with unwavering authority now looked fragile, diminished. For the first time since his collapse, he allowed himself to truly listen to his maid's words. "My grandmother used to say that," Mary continued, placing a steaming cup of chamomile tea before him. "Back in Kentucky, she healed people the doctors couldn't help. Not with medicine, but by finding what their souls needed." The billionaire's hands trembled slightly as he reached for the cup. "Sounds like superstition," he muttered, but without his usual dismissiveness. "Maybe," she acknowledged, "but I watched her work miracles with nothing but lavender, kind words, and understanding." As the night deepened around them, their conversation meandered through unexpected territories. Mary spoke of her grandmother's garden, how lavender had always been planted near the kitchen window to bring peace to troubled minds. John found himself sharing fragments of memories, Emily's favorite bedtime stories, her laughter when they'd visit the lakefront. She loved that little stuffed rabbit, he said, his voice breaking. I still have it in my office drawer. The maid nodded, her eyes reflecting compassion rather than pity. What about her resting place? Do you visit often? A heavy silence fell between them. Outside, Chicago's lights glimmered through falling snow. I've never been, John finally admitted, the words like stones in his throat. Not once in 5 years. Mary didn't seem surprised. You're afraid. I'm a coward, he corrected, anger flashing briefly. I've funded 3 children's hospitals since she died, but I can't stand at her grave for 5 minutes. Grief isn't measured in hospital wings or minutes at a graveside, she said gently. It's measured in how much we allow ourselves to feel it. John looked up, meeting her gaze directly. I don't know how to feel it without breaking completely. Nobody does, Mary replied. That's why we shouldn't face it alone. In that moment, something shifted between them, the invisible barrier between employer and employee dissolving into something more human, more healing. For the first time since Emily's death, John Smith felt the faintest flicker of hope that perhaps his soul, not just his body, could be mended. Maybe we should go together, Mary Johnson suggested softly, her voice barely audible above the howl of the winter wind outside. I won't judge, just stand beside you. She folded her hands in her lap, waiting patiently as John processed her words. John's heart pounded against his ribs. Visit Emily's grave? The thought alone made his hands tremble. For 5 years he had avoided that sacred plot of earth, as if his absence could somehow undo the reality of his daughter's death. The pharmaceutical tycoon who commanded boardrooms with unwavering confidence now sat paralyzed by the prospect of facing a small marble headstone. I don't know if I can, he whispered, his voice breaking. Mary reached across the kitchen table and gently placed her hand over his. You don't have to be strong there. That's what I'm trying to tell you. Something in her Kentucky-tinged accent carried such genuine compassion that John found himself nodding. A fragile hope, one he could barely acknowledge, even to himself, flickered to life inside him. Tomorrow morning, he said finally, before I lose my nerve. The following day dawned brutally cold. They wrapped themselves in heavy coats, scarves wound tightly around their necks, as they stepped into the bitter Chicago morning. The city seemed muted under its blanket of snow, cars moving slowly along salted streets, their headlights dim against the white landscape. Graceland Cemetery stood as a silent sanctuary amidst the urban sprawl. They entered through iron gates, their footsteps crunching along paths that wound between monuments and mausoleums. Centuries-old trees loomed overhead, their massive branches heavy with ice that glittered in the weak winter sunlight. John stopped suddenly, his breath visible in small, rapid clouds. It's just ahead, he said, his voice barely a whisper. Mary nodded, remaining a half-step behind him, close enough to support, but allowing him this moment. The small headstone appeared modest compared to the elaborate monuments surrounding it. Emily Smith, it read, followed by dates that spanned just 7 years. John stood trembling before it, his tall frame seeming to fold in on itself as the weight of his grief became physical. Snow began to fall again, delicate flakes catching in his grey hair as he stared at his daughter's name carved in stone. For several minutes he remained completely still, the only movement the occasional shudder that passed through his shoulders. Mary waited beside him, a quiet presence as the billionaire finally confronted what all his wealth and power could never change. In the pristine silence of Graceland Cemetery, surrounded by monuments to Chicago's elite, John Smith finally began to heal. Standing before Emily's grave, Mary Johnson opened the worn copy of The Secret Garden she had brought with her. Snow crunched beneath their feet as she found the passage she was looking for. Her voice, gentle yet unwavering, carried through the winter stillness of Graceland Cemetery. If you look the right way, you can see that the whole world is a garden, she read, the words hanging like crystals in the frigid air. And if you tend it with love, even the most neglected corner can bloom again. John Smith stood motionless, his expensive wool coat dusted with snowflakes, his eyes fixed on the small marble headstone. 5 years of avoided grief crashed through him, as Mary's words penetrated the walls he had built. His lips trembled, forming a name he hadn't spoken aloud since the funeral. Emily, he whispered, then louder. Emily? The pharmaceutical tycoon's composure crumbled completely as he sank to his knees in the snow. "My little girl." Tears streamed down his face, freezing against his cheeks in the Chicago winter. Mary knelt beside him, not touching, simply present as waves of grief poured from him in shuddering sobs. Ancient oaks stood sentinel around them, their ice-laden branches creating a cathedral of silence. "I'm so sorry," he repeated, his voice breaking. "I should have been there. I should have known you were sick." Mary placed a sprig of lavender on the grave, its purple barely visible against the white snow. "She knows," she said softly. "Children always know when they're loved." For nearly an hour, they remained there as John spoke to his daughter, about the hospitals he'd funded in her name, about the sunsets she'd loved to watch, about how much he missed her laugh. The words tumbled out, raw and healing, as Mary stood witness to his pain. When they finally turned to leave, something had shifted. John's steps were lighter, his breathing deeper. He looked at the winter sky with clearer eyes, as if seeing it for the first time in years. "Thank you," he said simply as they walked through the iron gates of the cemetery. The bitter wind seemed less cutting now. The city's winter harshness softened somehow. As they made their way back toward the waiting car, a fragile warmth grew between them. Not romance, but something equally precious. The billionaire and his maid walked side by side, equals in the democracy of grief and healing. John glanced back once more at the cemetery, then forward to the skyline of Chicago. For the first time in 5 years, he felt something stirring inside him that he had thought was gone forever. Hope. The penthouse transformed as if by magic. Vases of fresh flowers appeared in rooms that had once felt sterile and cold. John Smith's favorite chair, previously abandoned for hospital beds, now held him comfortably as he leafed through reports with renewed vigor. His appetite, absent for months, returned with surprising force. He even requested his chef prepare meals he hadn't enjoyed since before his illness. "I haven't seen you eat like this in years," Dr. Robert Davis remarked during a follow-up visit, noting the color returning to his patient's face and the steady hands that no longer trembled. The pharmaceutical tycoon merely smiled. "I'm feeling better than I have in a long time," he admitted, glancing toward the kitchen where Mary worked quietly. Mary Johnson moved through the penthouse with a lightness that seemed to transform the very air around her. Her gentle humming could be heard as she arranged fresh lavender in John's bedroom, the scent bringing peaceful sleep where nightmares had once dominated. The maid's presence had become essential to the healing that continued to unfold within these walls, a healing that went far beyond what medicine alone could accomplish. The staff noticed the change. The once grim atmosphere had given way to occasional laughter echoing down hallway. John's executive assistant observed how he now spoke Emily's name without his voice breaking, sometimes even sharing fond memories of his daughter. But not everyone celebrated this transformation. In the corporate offices downtown, whispers spread through the boardroom. How had a simple maid accomplished what 20 specialists couldn't? The rumors ranged from the ridiculous to the suspicious. Patricia Brown watched this development with growing unease. The vice president had been positioning herself to take control of the company during John's decline, and his unexpected recovery threatened everything she'd been planning. During a private meeting with other executives, she tapped her manicured nails against a polished conference table. "Don't you find it strange?" she asked her colleagues. "This woman appears from nowhere and suddenly he's cured?" There's more to this story. That evening, Patricia made a call to a private investigator. "I need everything you can find on Mary Johnson," she instructed. "Dig deep. Everyone has secrets." 3 days later, a thick manila folder landed on Patricia's desk. As she flipped through the pages, a slow, calculating smile spread across her face. Mary had indeed changed her name after leaving Kentucky. There were gaps in her employment history, questionable associations, and rumors of involvement in alternative healing practices that bordered on the fraudulent. "Got you," Patricia whispered, already planning how to use this information to remove the maid from John's life permanently. The manila folder landed on John Smith's desk with a soft thud, Patricia Brown's manicured fingernails tapping impatiently on its surface. The pharmaceutical tycoon glanced up, irritation flickering across his face at the interruption. "You'll want to see this," Patricia said, her voice carrying the false concern of someone who'd just discovered exactly what she'd been looking for. "It's about Mary." Inside lay a private investigator's report, complete with photographs and background checks. Mary Johnson wasn't who she claimed to be. She had changed her name after what the report clinically described as a family tragedy in Kentucky. The details were sparse but damning when framed by Patricia's narrative. "She's been lying to you from the beginning," the vice president said, leaning against the window frame. "Think about it, John. Your health improves, and suddenly this woman is at the center of your life. A woman with a hidden past and no medical credentials." John's hands trembled as he flipped through the pages. The warmth that had returned to his body seemed to drain away, replaced by a familiar coldness. Trust had never come easily to him, especially after Emily's death. "She's after your money," Patricia continued, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Classic con artist technique. Find someone vulnerable, isolated, wealthy, and move in for the kill." The billionaire stared at a photograph of Mary from years ago, under a different name. His mind raced through their moments together, at the cemetery, during their late-night conversations, the gentle way she'd placed lavender on his pillow. Had it all been calculated manipulation? When Mary entered the penthouse that afternoon, John was waiting in his study, the report spread across his desk. His face had hardened into the mask he wore in boardrooms. "Why didn't you tell me about your past?" he demanded without preamble. Mary froze, her eyes darting to the papers, then back to John's face. I wanted to," she stammered, her voice barely audible. "But I was afraid I'd discover you're not who you claim to be." John's voice was razor-sharp. "That you've been playing me for a fool?" "No." Tears welled in her eyes. "My intentions were pure. I changed my name to escape pain, not to deceive you." But John, consumed by old fears and betrayals, couldn't hear her truth. Patricia stood in the doorway, arms crossed, a slight smile playing at her lips. "Pack your things," he said coldly. "You're fired." Mary's face crumpled, but dignity straightened her spine. "You're making a terrible mistake," she whispered. "Not just for me, but for yourself." Mary Johnson stood motionless as security packed her few possessions into a worn canvas bag. The lavender sprigs she'd carefully dried were crushed beneath uniforms and toiletries. John Smith watched from across the penthouse, his face a mask of cold suspicion, the warmth they'd shared at the cemetery now frozen by Patricia Brown's calculated intervention. "I never meant to deceive you," Mary whispered, but John turned away, his shoulders rigid with distrust. The security guard escorted her to the elevator, his professional detachment a stark contrast to the intimacy she'd shared with the pharmaceutical tycoon just days before. As the doors slid closed, Mary caught a final glimpse of the penthouse, its gleaming surfaces suddenly sterile and lifeless, the vases of flowers already beginning to wilt. John stood alone in the vast silence, Patricia's report clutched in his trembling hand. The maid's departure left a void that seemed to expand with each passing hour. By nightfall the tremors returned, worse than before. His breath came in shallow gasps, and the weight on his chest felt unbearable. 3 days later, Dr. Robert Davis supervised John's readmission to the hospital. The billionaire's condition had deteriorated dramatically, his immune system collapsing, his body rejecting medication. The physician ordered a battery tests, but his eyes reflected what they both knew: science had no answers for a soul in retreat. "You were improving," Davis said quietly, adjusting the IV line. "What happened?" John turned toward the window, watching Chicago's skyline blur through unshed tears. The hospital room felt smaller than before, its walls closing in like a tomb. On the bedside table, his smartphone buzzed with urgent messages from the boardroom, Patricia moving pieces on the corporate chessboard, preparing for his absence. At night, memories of Emily flooded back, her laughter, her final days, the small hand going limp in his... But now these visions were intertwined with Mary's gentle presence, the way she'd stood beside him at Graceland Cemetery, her voice steady as she read from the secret garden. "I made a mistake," he whispered to the empty room. A nurse entered with medication, her efficiency a poor substitute for Mary's intuitive care. John swallowed the pills mechanically, knowing they couldn't reach the true source of his illness. The machines beeped in rhythmic confirmation of his physical decline, but they couldn't measure the regret consuming him from within. In his dreams, Emily appeared, holding Mary's hand, both of them walking away from him across a snowy field. He woke, calling both their names, reaching into emptiness, the hospital's sterile air a mockery of the lavender-scented warmth he'd so foolishly discarded. Christmas Eve blanketed Chicago in a silent shroud of white. John Smith lay motionless in his hospital bed, watching snowflakes dance against the darkness beyond his window. The sterile room felt colder than the winter night itself, antiseptic and impersonal, with beeping monitors providing the only conversation. Gone was the comforting scent of lavender that had briefly transformed his world. Instead, the pharmaceutical tycoon breathed in the sharp smell of disinfectant and medication. His condition had deteriorated rapidly after Mary's departure. The tremors had returned with greater intensity, and the weight he'd regained slipped away like sand through fingers. Dr. Robert Davis had visited earlier, his face etched with concern as he reviewed the latest test results. "I don't understand the regression," the physician had admitted, adjusting his glasses. "We were seeing such improvement." John knew why. The healing that had begun wasn't something that could be measured in blood tests or vital signs. It was deeper, a wound of the soul that had finally begun to close, only to be ripped open again by his own stubborn pride and Patricia's manipulations. A nurse entered, cheerfully arranging a small plastic Christmas tree on his bedside table. "To brighten things up," she said with forced holiday spirit. John barely acknowledged her presence, his thoughts drifting to Mary Johnson, the woman who had dared to lead him to Emily's grave, who had read from the secret garden while he finally confronted his grief. As darkness deepened outside, memories flooded back, Mary's gentle voice as she spoke of her grandmother's wisdom, the warmth of her hand holding his at the cemetery, the way she'd seen through his wealth and power to the broken man beneath. She had offered not judgment but understanding, not pity but compassion. The billionaire stared at the ceiling, suddenly struck by a truth so obvious it nearly took his breath away. 20 specialists from the world's finest medical institutions had failed to diagnose what Mary had seen immediately. He was dying not from disease, but from grief. With sudden clarity, John realized she was the only person who had truly seen him in years. Not as John Smith, the pharmaceutical giant, but as a father who couldn't bear to speak his daughter's name. Without hesitation, he pressed the call button. When the nurse appeared, he announced, "I'm checking myself out." "But sir, it's Christmas Eve, and your condition is my business," he interrupted, already pulling IV lines from his arm. 20 minutes later, against all medical advice, John stepped into the swirling snow, his hospital gown exchanged for hastily gathered clothes. The cold air bit at his face as he hailed a taxi, his heart pounding with urgency and hope. "Where to?" asked the driver. "To find the woman who saved my life," John replied, his voice stronger than it had been in weeks. The Chicago Central Station bustled with holiday travelers, but John Smith spotted her immediately. Mary Johnson stood alone near Platform 7, a worn suitcase clutched in her gloved hand, her face partially hidden beneath a woolen scarf. The pharmaceutical tycoon pushed through the crowd, his heart pounding against his weakened chest. Every step felt like a mile as he navigated through families and couples embracing for Christmas reunions. "Mary," he called out, his voice barely carrying over the station announcements. She turned, surprise flickering across her face, before hardening into something more guarded. The maid had already purchased her ticket back to Kentucky, back to a life without the pain his distrust had caused. "Please," John gasped, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "Don't go." Mary shook her head, clutching her suitcase tighter. "You made your choice, Mr. Smith. You believed Patricia's accusations without even asking me." The billionaire's legs trembled, whether from illness or emotion he couldn't tell. Around them, travelers hurried past, oblivious to the drama unfolding. Outside, snow fell in thick, silent curtains blanketing the city in white. "I was wrong," John whispered, his voice breaking. Then, to the shock of onlookers, he fell to his knees on the cold marble floor. "I've been wrong about so many things." Tears spilled down his cheeks, freezing almost instantly in the December chill blowing through the station's open doors. Mary took a half step forward, her resolve wavering. "Your past doesn't matter to me," he continued, not caring who witnessed his vulnerability. "What matters is that you saw me, really saw me, when no one else could." She remained silent, her eyes reflecting both hurt and longing. "Emily," John said, his daughter's name emerging like a prayer. "You helped me say her name again. You helped me visit her grave. 20 specialists couldn't heal what you did with simple compassion." At the mention of Emily, Mary's expression softened. She recognized the transformation in him, how he'd finally spoken his daughter's name without shattering. "I don't need a maid," John said, rising slowly to his feet. "I need you, Mary, the woman who taught me that healing begins with facing what we've lost." The station's clock chimed, announcing the imminent departure of the southbound train. Mary glanced toward the platform, then back at John's tear-streaked face. "I can't promise I won't make mistakes," he said, "but I promise I'll never shut you out again." Mary released her grip on the suitcase, letting it rest beside her on the polished floor. "Emily would want you to be happy," she said softly, taking a step toward him. The Chicago skyline glittered with winter lights as John Smith and Mary Johnson returned to the glass-walled penthouse together. The space that had once felt like a mausoleum now pulsed with renewed energy. Mary moved through the rooms with quiet purpose, opening curtains that had remained closed for months, letting sunlight stream across polished floors. "It feels different," John whispered, his voice stronger than it had been in weeks, "like the place can breathe again." Mary smiled, placing fresh lavender in small vases throughout the home. The familiar scent wafted through the air, replacing the sterile emptiness that had lingered for so long. Within days, the transformation was remarkable, not just in the penthouse, but in John himself. Color returned to his face. His hands no longer trembled when he reached for his morning coffee. The pharmaceutical tycoon who had been at death's door now walked with steady steps, his eyes clear and focused. Most surprising to his staff was the sound of laughter echoing down hallways that had known only hushed, anxious whispers for months. Dr. Robert Davis observed the change with professional fascination and personal wonder. During a follow-up visit, he recorded vital signs that showed dramatic improvement across every measure. The physician who had exhausted every medical resource in his attempt to diagnose John's mysterious illness now found himself confronting an equally mysterious recovery. "I've been practicing medicine for 30 years, Dr. Davis admitted, sitting across from John in the sunlit living room. "But what's happening here challenges everything I thought I knew about healing." The doctor's words spread quickly through Chicago's medical community. At a conference at Northwestern Memorial, he stood before his colleagues and spoke with humility that silenced the room. "We've developed remarkable technologies to examine the body," he said, "but we've forgotten how to see the person." John Smith's case proves what many of us have secretly suspected, that true healing requires more than science. It demands compassion, understanding, and the courage to face wounds that no scan can detect. In the penthouse, Mary arranged flowers by the window overlooking the lake. John approached, watching her hands work with the same gentle confidence that had somehow called him back from the brink. "The board meeting is tomorrow," he said quietly. "Patricia's going to be furious." Mary looked up, her eyes meeting his. "Are you afraid?" John considered this, then shook his head. "Not anymore." Outside, snow began to fall, but inside, spring had already arrived in the blooming flowers, in John's steadying heartbeat, and in the promise of healing that extended far beyond what 20 doctors had failed to achieve. John Smith and Mary Johnson stood before the gleaming sign of their newly founded Smith-Johnson Center for Integrated Healing. The modern facility, nestled in downtown Chicago, represented everything they had learned through their extraordinary journey together, with large windows allowing natural light to flood the reception area and walls adorned with soothing artwork. The center embodied their philosophy that healing environments matter as much as treatments themselves. "Science and soul together at last," Mary whispered, squeezing John's hand as they welcomed their first patients. The pharmaceutical tycoon had invested millions from his personal fortune, insisting that no family would ever be turned away for financial reasons. Robert Davis had joined their team as medical director, his perspective on healing forever changed by what he'd witnessed. "Sometimes the most powerful medicine isn't in a bottle," he often told his colleagues, a statement that would have been unimaginable from him a year earlier. Their most memorable early patient arrived on a snowy Tuesday morning. 7-year-old Sophie hadn't spoken a word since witnessing her brother's fatal accident 3 months prior. Her parents, desperate after multiple therapists had failed, brought her to the center as a last resort. Mary recognized the hollow look in the child's eyes immediately, the same emptiness she'd seen in John during his darkest days. While specialists prepared assessment forms, the former maid gently took Sophie's hand and led her to a sunlit corner filled with plants and comfortable cushions. "I lost someone special too," Mary said softly, not expecting a response. She simply sat beside the girl, allowing silence to exist between them without pressure to fill it. John watched from the doorway, his throat tightening with emotion. He remembered how Mary had sat with him, just like this, offering presence instead of platitudes when words would have only built higher walls. After 20 minutes, Sophie reached for a crayon and drew a small blue flower on a piece of paper. She pushed it toward Mary without looking up. "It's beautiful," Mary said. "Is blue his favorite color?" The child nodded almost imperceptibly, her first communication in months. By their third session, Sophie had whispered her brother's name. By the fifth, she was telling Mary stories about him between tears and tiny smiles. "You've given her permission to remember without drowning in grief," John told Mary later that evening as they walked through Graceland Cemetery, now a place of peace rather than torment for him. Mary smiled, her eyes reflecting the sunset. "That's what you taught me, John. Healing isn't about forgetting. It's about remembering with love instead of pain." Patricia Brown had resigned from the company, unable to witness the transformation she'd tried so desperately to prevent. Meanwhile, the waiting list for the Smith-Johnson Center grew longer each day, as word spread about the place where science and compassion worked hand in hand. John Smith's penthouse, once a fortress of isolation atop Chicago's skyline, had transformed completely. The cold, sterile spaces where he had hidden from the world now brimmed with warmth and life. Fresh flowers adorned tables that once held only business reports, and the scent of lavender gently permeated rooms that had known nothing but emptiness for years. On a crisp autumn evening, laughter echoed through the glass walls as John hosted a small gathering of friends, real friends, not the business associates who had previously populated his life out of obligation or ambition. Robert Davis was there, sharing stories with a group of medical students interested in the integrated healing approach he now championed alongside traditional medicine. "I've learnt more about healing in the past year than in 30 years of medical practice," the physician admitted, raising his glass toward Mary Johnson, who smiled warmly from across the room. Mary's own apartment had undergone a similar transformation. The modest space she had once retreated to after long days of invisible service, now regularly filled with neighbors, colleagues from the healing center, and friends who appreciated her wisdom and gentle strength. Photos of Kentucky landscapes hung on walls that had once been bare, connecting her to roots she no longer needed to hide. The background check that Patricia Brown had intended as a weapon had instead become a bridge, allowing Mary to reclaim parts of her past she had sealed away. The vice president had eventually left the company, unable to adapt to the new culture of compassion that had replaced cutthroat ambition. One evening, as they watched the sun set over Lake Michigan, John took Mary's hand, his fingers no longer trembling with illness but steady with purpose. "I spent decades building wealth," he said quietly, "but you taught me how to build something that matters." Mary squeezed his hand, remembering the broken man she had first met, how far they had both come from maid and master to partners in healing. Together they expanded the Smith-Johnson Center, creating spaces where medical science and human connection worked in harmony. Children who had known only clinical treatments found comfort in gardens designed for healing. Doctors who had relied solely on technology learned to listen with their hearts. John, once defined by his billions and later by his mysterious illness, now found identity in something far more valuable: the capacity to love openly again. The man who couldn't speak his daughter's name now honored her memory by helping other families heal from similar wounds. The legacy they built reached far beyond wealth or status. It touched lives with something money could never buy: the simple, transformative power of an open heart. A year had passed since that fateful night when John Smith had knelt in the snow, begging for a second chance. Now, on a crisp winter morning, he stood before Emily's grave at Graceland Cemetery, fresh flowers in his gloved hands. Mary Johnson stood beside him, her fingers intertwined with his, offering silent strength as snowflakes danced around them. "She would have loved today," John whispered, carefully arranging the bouquet against the headstone. His voice no longer carried the weight of unbearable guilt, but rather the gentle ache of a father who had learned to honor his grief instead of drowning in it. Mary squeezed his hand. "I think she knows you're here," she said softly. The cemetery stretched before them, a peaceful landscape of marble and snow, the ancient trees standing sentinel over generations of Chicago's departed. As they walked back along the winding path, John paused to look at the city skyline in the distance. His pharmaceutical empire continued to thrive, but with a new direction. Under his and Mary's joint leadership, the Smith-Johnson Center for Integrated Healing had helped hundreds of patients find paths to recovery that traditional medicine alone couldn't provide. Robert Davis had become their strongest advocate in the medical community, publishing papers on the remarkable outcomes they'd achieved by combining cutting-edge treatments with compassionate care. Even Patricia Brown had eventually come around, though it had taken the center's undeniable success to convince her of the value in their approach. Back at the penthouse that evening, they hosted a small gathering to mark the anniversary of their healing journey. The once sterile space now felt like a true home, filled with warmth and photographs, including one of Emily prominently displayed on the mantel. 20 doctors with all their expertise couldn't diagnose what was killing me, John told their guests, his arm around Mary's shoulder. It took someone who cleaned my home to see that I was dying from a broken heart. Mary, no longer just the maid but his partner in every sense, smiled up at him. "Sometimes the most powerful medicine isn't found in a laboratory," she said. Later, after everyone had gone, they stood by the window watching snow blanket the city. John reflected on how close he'd come to losing everything, not just his health or his company, but his capacity to feel joy again. "You saved me," he said simply. Mary shook her head. "You saved yourself. I just showed you the door." 20 doctors had failed to save the billionaire, but in the end, it wasn't medical science that had healed him. It was a maid with Kentucky wisdom and the courage to see beyond his weight to the wounded soul beneath. Together they had discovered that true healing begins when the heart finally opens to love.